Jordan Peterson is clear where he stands on most issues.
Do you think a trans woman is a woman?
No.
But when it comes to the question of if he's a Christian or not, he always seems hesitant to answer.
Do you believe that Jesus rose again from the dead? Literally.
I cannot answer that question.
And so it makes sense why 40,000 of you responded to my poll asking if he was a Christian or not, and about 20% believes that he is, about 20% believes that he isn't, and almost half of you are confused and have no idea what he actually believes. But after listening to hundreds of hours of him talk about this subject, understanding the evolution of his religious views, and talking with people who know him closely, I'm confident that I can offer you some clarity on not only what he actually believes, but also if he's actually a Christian or not. So let's get into it. Things will make more sense once you understand how his religious views evolved over the years. When Peterson was 12, his mother enrolled him in a class at church, which seemed to have left him with more questions than answers. He not only found himself disinterested in what he was learning, but also in disbelief about it. After asking his teacher questions about science and religion, he found his teacher incapable of answering his questions in an honest way, which ultimately led Peterson to conclude that religion was for the ignorant, weak, and the superstitious. He rejected the religious views that were given to him, chalking up God, the existence of hell, and the resurrection of Christ as downright impossibilities, putting him on the path to becoming an atheist. He started to view the world from a materialistic perspective, meaning that the only things that existed were physical and everything in the world was the result of purely physical processes. It was at this point that Peterson considered himself to be a materialistic atheist. He saw the world as being a world of only physical matter, and because physical things in and of themselves don't have any meaning, he essentially saw the atheistic world of matter to ultimately be meaningless. And for a while, a world of matter seemed to make sense of the world. But all of that seemed to suddenly change when the unexpected happened, which made him start to question everything that he believed to be true once again. As Peterson began to study psychology in college, he would visit with prison inmates who had committed unimaginable crimes. Peterson was struck by one inmate in particular who seemed incredibly normal and non-threatening, only to learn later that this inmate had committed horrendous crimes. This led Peterson to be afraid of his own capacity for evil, which was followed by a series of frightening apocalyptic dreams that he had a couple of times a week for about 1 year straight. To young Peterson, these events couldn't simply be explained by purely physical processes in a satisfactory way. It was this existential crisis that led Peterson to the works of the famous psychologist Carl Jung, which he hoped could help him make more sense of everything that was going on. Now, though he didn't find all of his answers in Jung's work nonetheless pulled Peterson deeper into the world of psychology. And against all expectations, it was his studying of psychology that made him realize that he had been completely wrong about the atheistic beliefs that he had once been so convinced of.
I'm not an atheist anymore, because I don't look at the world that way anymore. I'm not a materialist anymore. I don't think the world's made out of matter. I think it's made out of what matters.
Studying to be a psychologist meant that he would specially be trained in understanding the world through our subjective lenses and our personal perception. In the world of psychology, our personal perceptions shape our reality and how we navigate this world. And it was this way of thinking that served as the foundation for how he saw everything, which he made clear in his 1999 book, Maps of Meaning. In the book and other places, Peterson expressed the idea that every physical object or event only has meaning and value if we give it meaning and value. Now, this might be overly simplistic, but it gets the point across for the purpose of this video. So for example, think about a diamond. A diamond is just another rock until we put it on a ring and call it a symbol of love. Now all of a sudden the rock has meaning and value that the rocks in your front yard simply don't have. The only reason why a diamond is more valuable to us than other rocks is simply because we deemed it to be that way. For Peterson, the way that we create meaning and value is through myths and stories, like stories about what a diamond and a ring means in marriage, and we use them as a way to give our lives and our culture a way to have meaning. These stories provide a model for how society should work and for how individuals should behave. So for now, we can call this view a purely psychological perspective of the world. A purely psychological perspective means that there's nothing that has any meaning outside of what humans have created from our psychological perceptions. If you can understand this, then you're far better to understand what Peterson is saying when he talks about religion than the vast majority of people. This is the foundation to everything that Peterson says about the world, including God and the Bible. But remember what he said.
I'm not an atheist anymore.
So, case closed. He's no longer an atheist and he now believed in God, right? Well, Not so fast. We'll come back to that question here in a moment. However, this perspective did lead to what would be one of his most successful teachings today, his Bible lectures. Given his new view that meaning was fundamental to how he understood all of reality, this prompted Peterson to revisit the biblical stories that he had once abandoned in his youth. He started to find value and meaning in the religious texts that he used to believe to be non-existent during his time as a materialistic atheist. The outworking of his studies accumulated to one particular day in May of 2017 when Peterson started his famous biblical lectures on the book of Genesis titled The Psychological Significance of the Bible. And against all expectations and intentions, these biblical lectures led Peterson to perhaps be the most influential Bible interpreter alive today, as his lectures have generated over 50 million views on YouTube so far. Giving his audience a view of the Bible in a way that most of them haven't ever considered before, thousands of people testified that the lectures had a significant impact on their lives for the better, and several non-Christians also decided to become Christians as a result as well. But even though these lectures left so many people far more open to the Bible than they were before, they also left some people feeling confused about Peterson and his motives. People simply weren't used to hearing a non-Christian talk about the Bible with such passion and conviction, which led onlookers to wonder if Peterson was nearing a Christian conversion or if he was secretly a Christian himself. But the question that everyone wanted to know was, did his investigations of the Bible lead him to believe that God and the Bible were true in what we might call an objective sense? Or, given his psychological view of the world, did he see God and the Bible to be merely products of the human imagination? Well, clarity for that question could be found in a 2017 interview taken around the same time that he was giving his lectures on the Bible. In the interview, his religious beliefs came up, and here's what he said.
So people often ask me, do you believe in God? Which I don't like that question. And the reason I don't like to answer it is because A, I don't like to be boxed in, and B, because I don't know what the person means by believe or God. And they think they know. And the probability that they construe belief and construe God the same way I do is virtually zero.
All right, now that answer was far more accurate than you might initially think. When Peterson talked about God, he was doing so from a world of meaning and his purely psychological perspective. So the reason that he says that he and Christians don't mean the same thing when they're talking about God is because Christians tend to approach the question of God from the starting point of believing that God created the world and that God is the one who gives our lives meaning according to his purpose. But from Peterson's purely psychological perspective, it's almost backwards. For Peterson, as humans, we created God for the purpose of us giving our lives meaning and purpose. Remember, he's operating from a purely psychological perspective of the world. So in other words, the God that Peterson believed in at this time would not be real in the sense that if none of us existed, then God would still exist. Instead, God only existed in the minds of humans since he believes that humans created stories about God as a way to describe our behavior and orient our lives towards something greater. So once you understand that he's speaking from the framework of a purely psychological perspective, it makes more sense when he talks about the existence of hell and Jesus.
I also believe in hell, although what that means again is, subject to interpretation. Lots of people live in hell, and lots of people create it. Then with regards to these other issues, the divinity of Christ, well, I would say the same problems with the question formulation obtain. For all intents and purposes, I believe that the Logos is divine. Insofar as if by divine you mean of ultimate value, of ultimate transcendent value, yes, it's divine. The Logos dismantles you and rebuilds you. So that's what happens when you make an error. When you make an error, some part of you has to go. That's a sacrifice. You have to let it go. Sometimes it's a big part of you. Is there something more than merely metaphorical about the idea of dying and being reborn? Yes, there is, because those are associated with physiological transformations.
Now, when most people hear that clip, they may think that he's speaking as a Christian. After all, he's talking about Logos or Christ being divine, and he's also talking about the existence of hell. But now that you and I know that he's operating from a purely psychological perspective, we're far better able to understand what he's really saying. By hell here, he's referring to what happens when you make bad decisions, resulting in your life being a chaotic mess. For Peterson, hell is what we create on earth in the here and now. But when most Christians talk about hell, they mean eternal separation from a literal God in the life after this life. And when Christians are talking about the divinity of Christ, they're saying that Christ is God in human flesh in a very real and literal sense. But when Peterson talks about the divinity of Christ, he's referring to what we give ultimate value to. When he talks about Christ, he's making a separation between the historical person of Christ and the story of Christ. It's kind of like Superman. Someone can look to the story of Superman to be inspired to live a life of courage and virtue, and so for them, in one sense, Superman can be real since he has an impact on how they live their lives. But that doesn't mean that Superman actually did all of the things in that story, or even that he's real beyond their conception of him. So for Peterson at this point, the story of Christ is kind of like that. He's willing to say that the story of Christ goes beyond metaphor, but what he means by that is that by believing in the idea of Christ, it leads to real transformations in your life, and the belief has a real physiological effect on your body. Alright, so all in all, his view in 2017 was clear. He was only comfortable saying that he believed in God and Christianity as they relate to our lives in the here and now, and only as they depend on human perception. So at this point, God, Jesus, hell, and the resurrection were all metaphors for how we live. But not too long after this interview, a tragedy occurred that would cast doubt on Peterson's purely psychological view of the world. Peterson's world was turned upside down in April of 2019 after his wife Tammy was diagnosed with a rapidly growing kidney cancer that doctors gave a 100% fatality rate within a year regardless of any medical treatments. This only added to the stress and problems that impacted him and his family, which led him to take benzodiazepine, an anti-anxiety and sleeping aid, which would eventually become another problem. He essentially found himself unable to get off of the pills when he no longer needed them, something that would eventually lead Peterson to have to check himself into a rehab center. Here, he dealt with incredible physical complications from the withdrawals and even battled questions of whether he wanted to continue to live or not. And to make matters worse, this lasted for nearly a year. His daughter Michaela released a video during this time saying that both Jordan and Tammy Peterson almost died multiple times during this season. Tammy was in the hospital and things were looking as bad as ever. Once again, there was no known solution to Tammy's kidney cancer, but the doctors were doing everything that they could to help her. Sadly, this resulted in multiple failed surgeries until the absolutely unexpected happened. This time, it wasn't something that Peterson could easily explain, and it wasn't something that his logical thinking side could wrap around, and this would become a major turning point in Peterson's life.
He had to fly to the US to get surgery again, and nothing was working. And at some part through that experience, she found God. This is when things got like spooky weird. She wasn't eating, she's being fed through a tube, it was bad, and she goes, "I'll be better by our anniversary." And my parents' anniversary is mid-August. And we're like, okay, Mom, Mom's on morphine. I'll be better by our anniversary. She flew down to the States and had this surgery, and the surgery failed. And on their anniversary, she recovered. And nobody understood why, right? And all the doctors didn't understand why, and nobody understood why. And it was kind of like, oh, that's a weird day. And you said that was going to happen a month ago. And how is that possible? And she was like, God. And I was like, okay, not entirely sure how I can logic my way out of that.
Needless to say, this journey was very difficult for Peterson and his family, but his wife's miraculous recovery was an event that Peterson wasn't able to fully explain given his purely psychological view of the world. When Peterson finally came back into the public eye, it seemed that these experiences may have caused a change in the attention that he gave towards Christianity. By 2021, Peterson was talking about Christianity now more than ever, and he also appeared to be visibly wrestling with these miracles in Christianity given his view of the world. Perhaps the clearest example of this was during a conversation with Jonathan Pageau when Peterson unexpectedly broke down crying, trying to make sense of Jesus given his purely psychological view of the world.
Difference, and C.S. Lewis pointed this out as well, the difference between those mythological gods and Christ was that there's a historical representation of his existence as well. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived, plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief, and I don't understand it. Because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. That's Jungian synchronicity. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. You know, we have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. Like, we treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. But the narrative and the objective world touch. And the ultimate example of that, in principle, is supposed to be Christ. But I don't know what to... that seems to me oddly plausible.
Yeah.
But I still don't know what to make of it. It's too... partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it.
If you believed in the story of Christ, or if you believed that history and let's say the narrative meet, let's
both, I
say.
think you, because when you believe that, you buy both those stories. You believe that the narrative and the objective can actually touch.
This may have been the first time that most of us understood just how strongly Peterson seemed to be wrestling with the thought of Christianity and if it could actually be true beyond a purely psychological perspective. The reason why this was so conflicting for Peterson was because, as we know, in his world of meaning, or the narrative world as it calls it here, all meaning had to be created by humans. But when it comes to the story of Christ, if the story really happened in the world of matter or objective reality, then Christ would have to precede a world of meaning. Maybe Jesus wasn't just a perfect archetype that we created for the purpose of giving our lives meaning and orientation. Instead, maybe this perfect archetype that we find in the story of Jesus could actually be an objectively real and perfect person instead of merely the idea of perfection. If so, it wouldn't be us judging ourselves by this standard in a pragmatic and a fictional sense, but instead it would be Jesus judging us in a very real and consequential sense. This would also mean that meaning didn't start from human minds, but instead it would start from a cosmic mind that created us. But probably even more frightening for Peterson was that if this were true, then this would mean that Peterson's purely psychological view of the world would have to be completely wrong, destroying assurance in everything that he believed. This is part of the reason for why such a possibility is both terrifying and beautiful to Peterson at the same time. But although the interview showed Peterson wrestling with the thought of Christianity being true in what we might call an objective sense, we never got a final conclusion during that episode as to if he changed his psychological perspective of the world or not. Was this a turning point for Peterson, or was it just a one-off? Well, we got some more insight into that question sometime after the episode when Peterson was being interviewed on the Joe Rogan Experience, and during the episode, Peterson made this bold claim about the Bible.
And so it isn't that the Bible is true. It's that the Bible is the precondition for the manifestation of truth, which makes it way more true than just true. It's a whole different kind of true. And I think this is not only literally the case, factually, I think it can't be any other way. It's the only way we can solve the problem of perception.
Now, after this clip took the internet by storm, a lot of Christians took what he said to be further evidence that Peterson had indeed converted into being a Bible-believing Christian. Now, even though I can understand why people came to that conclusion, I still believe that people were misunderstanding his point. I made a video explaining what I believed him to be saying, which he seemed to confirm in a few tweets that he shared along with my video. It seemed to me that people in general were missing the point that he was trying to make. And although Peterson's view of Jesus did seem to be progressing to a point that his purely psychological view of the world wasn't able to account for, he seemed to retreat back to the limits of his psychological view.
We could say that in the highest sense, in the biblical corpus, God is the ultimate fictional character. And then we're trying to characterize his nature as that which should be emulated, that unites us psychologically and socially.
Now, though Peterson likely doesn't take fiction here to mean fake, he doesn't see his truth in the same way that most Christians do either. When it comes to a Christian view of the world, when most Christians talk about God, they mean that God is the ultimate real being that created us and the universe and exists regardless of human existence. So what did he think about hell?
You have to face the reality of hell. You might say, well, I don't believe in hell. It's like, well, do you believe in Nazi Germany? You know, do you believe in Stalinist Soviet Union or Maoist China or Cambodia? Hell is actually participation in the process that led to the establishment of those countries.
But of course, by hell, Christians usually mean eternal separation from a very real and eternal God after this life, not during. very different from what Peterson is saying. And once again, by the resurrection of Christ, Christians are referring to the singular event in history of God bringing Jesus back to life after being dead for 3 literal days. So when it comes to questions of God, Jesus, hell, and the resurrection, his view hasn't seemed to change all that much, although it did seem to be the case that his view became more difficult for him to have everything fit into his purely psychological view of the world. At least that's what I thought until I had a conversation with his daughter in 2022, shortly after she converted to Christianity. She told me at that time that his views may be changing from a purely psychological view of the world to something much more objective.
So if your dad kind of has more of that psychological perspective, you have more of like an objective kind of view of Christianity, right? Like this actually happened. Is that right? That's what I thought. And what do you think caused that difference?
So I think Dad goes back and forth. I think the longer he's talking about it, the more he's moving towards the objective view. Okay. I think understanding as much about psychology as he does, there's psychological significance to the Bible, and I believe it's objective, right? Yeah. So there's psychological significance to like every aspect of the Bible in multiple ways, plus it's objective. And so I think he probably got wrapped up in the psychological significance. So I think he got wrapped up in that, but I also think that he's writing a book at the moment called We Who Wrestle with God.
Cool.
Yeah, it's going to be intense.
So she told me this almost 2 years ago now. So the big question is, how has his views changed since he started writing his book? Has he found a way to resolve the tension between the world of meaning and the world of Christianity? And what does he actually believe about God and Christianity today? In October of 2023, Piers Morgan asked Peterson if he believed in God, and perhaps the most telling part is when Piers asks Peterson if he prays.
Here's my supplementary. Do you ever pray?
Always.
Who do you pray to?
The spirit that protects you from hell.
Now, when Peterson says spirit, we have to understand how Peterson has always used the word spirit. By spirit, he's always meant patterns of being, not an unembodied person. So this is different than what Christians mean, because when Christians pray to the creator of the universe, not merely a pattern of behavior or being. And when given another opportunity to explain what he means by God, even more recently, in May of 2024, he described the spirit of God that he believes in more clearly.
So imagine that as you mature, you're a child, and then you're an adult. Things beckon to you. Okay, but they change.
Yeah.
What beckons? It's a definition. God. And what is it? Well, it's the same thing that broods over the water. It's the same thing that brings the prideful to their knees. It's the same thing that produces the flood or the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's the same thing as the call to adventure. It's the same thing as the crucifixion of Christ. It's all the same thing. That's the monotheistic hypothesis. Does it exist? Does the call to adventure exist? It's what develops you. It's what you encourage in your children. You act like it exists.
Now, as you probably know by now, when Christians talk about God, Christians are referring to the God of the universe who we didn't create in our minds, but instead the God that created us and our minds. But when it comes to Jesus, a lot of Christians were saying that Peterson believes that Christ is the only way. So does that mean that Peterson now believes in Jesus in the same way that Christians believe in Jesus? Well, here's how he answers that question.
Do I believe that Christ is the way and the life and that no one comes to the Father but through him? Sure. But I also know what that means. It means that, imagine that you want to have the Spirit of the Almighty dwell within you, say, in this Old Testament manner. How do you do that? By taking the burden of life on yourself voluntarily. Why? Because that causes the best within you to make itself manifest.
But when Christians say that Christ is the only way, Christians tend to believe that Jesus died for our sins so that way we could be in a right relationship with the perfect God. And that keeps us out of hell. But when it comes to the existence of hell, does Peterson now believe in life after death?
Do you think there is life after death? Even if you have no kind of a way of knowing that infallibly, do you act as if there is? Do you think there is?
Your actions echo in eternity.
What does that mean?
It's best I got, man.
So it sounds like he's once again referring to his old view that limits our actions to the current world and the consequences it has for future generations. I don't believe that he's saying that there's actually life after death. But when it comes to the resurrection, now here's where things get really interesting. Given what we've heard him say so far, we'd probably be quick to write him off, saying that his view hasn't changed much since his 1999 book, Maps of Meaning. However, in his recent discussion with Alex O'Connor, people were shocked to hear him say this.
Do you believe in the resurrection of Jesus? Are you a Christian? If I went back in time with a Panasonic video camera and put that camera in front of the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, would the little LCD screen show a man walk out of that tomb?
I would suspect yes.
So finally, this seems to finally be a change in his usual answers, doesn't it? Well, kinda, because listen to what else he says right after that.
Which means that when somebody says, do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? It doesn't seem clear to me why you're not able to just say, it would seem to me yes.
Because I have no idea what that means. And neither did the people who saw it.
So when it comes to his view of the resurrection changing, we might be tempted to say that this is the most clear example of his beliefs evolving. And to this I would say yes, but also no, because if we go back to his 2017 interview, when he was asked the same question, here's how he responded.
Did his body resurrect? I don't know. I don't know. What the accounts mean isn't clear.
And in 2018, he said this.
Do you believe that Jesus rose again from the dead?
I would say that at the moment I'm agnostic about that issue.
And in 2019,
the claim is so overwhelming and also so mysterious that I don't know what to make of it. I don't know what to make of the idea of the physical resurrection.
All right, so in one sense, yes. He now seems to believe that the resurrection probably happened in an objective sense, but at the same time, he can't make sense of what it means. The best way that I can explain this is to say that for Peterson, it doesn't really matter if Jesus was raised from the dead or if a rock fell down the hill. Those events in themselves don't tell us anything. As we showed earlier, for Peterson, the only meaning that exists is the meaning that humans give those events. So in this way, what matters to Peterson is the meaning of these facts, meaning that he doesn't believe that he can access, because if everything starts from human perception, then how could he possibly understand any meaning that starts from God's perspective? This is why I believe that he says to Alex that not only does he not know what the resurrection means, but
and neither did the people who saw it.
And once again, here's where we're reminded of the limits of Peterson's worldview. Counter to what many seem to think, a careful listening of Peterson reveals that he's been stuck at this point for a very long time, far longer than most of us even knew who Peterson was.
I'm not fully comfortable with my ability to bridge the gap between the metaphorical and the real.
I don't understand the structure of being well enough. I don't know what that ideal means metaphysically, right, in relationship to reality, because I don't understand, for example, the relationship between the objective and the subjective at all.
So it seems to me that not only has Peterson been stuck between the world of meaning and the world of Christianity for several years now, but unless Peterson changes his view of the world, or in other words, changes his purely psychological view of the world, I honestly believe that Peterson has gone just about as far as he can go when it comes to how he understands the Bible and Christianity. He can continue to find more psychological meanings and applications in the biblical message, but it's his view of the world that's preventing him from being able to fully understand and integrate certain historical Christian beliefs that the rest of us seem to share. And this is why we don't, as far as I know, hear Peterson talk much about sin, eternal salvation, God's mercy, or the gospel of grace, which is where I would assume that Peterson and I would have our sharpest disagreement. Since we don't hear him claim that Christ is more than merely an archetype, it makes sense as to why he seems to exclusively focus on how we can live like Christ and what it means for us to strive for perfection. Now, don't get me wrong, this is great for how we should aspire to live as Christians, but it doesn't take into account how we're saved and our need for the sacrifice of Christ. We aren't saved by living perfect lives, but instead by realizing that we can't. Once we understand just how short we fall before a perfect God, then we can understand our need for a Savior. And that enables us to accept the perfect sacrifice of Christ that He offers to us in our place, and then it's His Spirit that enables us to live better lives, since we're now free to serve God and others for the right reasons. Our motivations are no longer out of fear, but out of gratitude for what God has done for us, and this is how we change from the inside out, or as Christ said, we clean the inside of the cups, and then the outside will also be clean. So, is Jordan Peterson a Christian? Well, if your definition of a Christian is someone who trusts in Jesus, not only for this life in this world, but also to bring us into the next life and to reign with him, publicly, Peterson hasn't stated such. But I would still be remiss if I didn't remind us that Peterson never said that the psychological perspective is all that he believes about Christianity. And so it's possible that Peterson could have changed his view of the world and actually does believe in Christianity in the same way that most of us do. However, if this is the case, then for one reason or another, he's choosing not to make that information public. Of course, that's all very possible. Another plausible explanation of Peterson's views here is that when he talks about psychology, that's the world that he feels like he can be sure about. But when it goes beyond the world of psychology, there he seems to be more of a hopeful agnostic in some sense. But as open as Peterson is in public, I believe that the most likely explanation is that he's still wrestling with how to make sense of the things that extend beyond his view of the world. Alright, so all in all, regardless of his current beliefs, his lectures have still proven to bridge the gap from a secular world and its openness to Christianity in a way that no one else has been able to. I believe that his perspective has been, at least in part, responsible for the change of tone among so many popular influencers like Joe Rogan towards Christianity, and we can reasonably say that he served a critical function for the resurgence of Christianity that we're currently witnessing. So, no matter what you think about Peterson, it's clear that God has used Peterson to bring people to himself, and we pray that this will not only continue, but also that if Peterson hasn't yet, that he also discovers Christ for who he truly is. The creator of the universe, the creator of the world, and the creator of Peterson himself. Now, I hope that this video helped you to better understand Peterson's view, as this was an incredibly difficult video to articulate, given the fact that Peterson often defines his words in a way that most of us simply don't. His view is genuinely complex, so when he responds to the question of if he believes in God or Christ by saying that it depends on what you mean by those words, I don't think that he's dodging. And if you've made it this far, then you may as well hit the like button to let YouTube know that this video is worth watching, and consider supporting the channel at the link below. Alright? See you guys next time.